Security bots don't like configuration files, especially if they contain sensitive information like passwords, such as we might have in this example here. Let's talk through some options to deal with this, and I'll show you a simple but effective solution I use to get those security types off my back. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, whenever it is that I find you. So we're going to talk about security and encrypting your settings today. So what I've got set up here is a simple .NET 6 solution, and I've added in some logging to it, and in the app settings I've got a custom app settings section with just a couple of values in it at the moment that we can read in. So over here, typically the way that we would use a custom section is that we have to go and create a specific class for our section, and we read those values into properties within that class. So then back over in our program CS, we then register that particular class, and we ask the configuration manager to go and populate our class using this get method here, and that instantiates our class for us and gives us back our settings that we can then go and access. So when I run this up, that I've actually already started down here, and show this in the browser, we can see that we're getting our hello world over here in the browser, so the app's up and running. But in our debug trace down here, we can see that we've actually pulled those two values out of our configuration. So nothing too clever at this point. So how do we go about having some kind of encrypted value in here? What we need is some kind of cryptographic class that we can use to encrypt and decrypt some data for us. So I've got a simple class here called crypto, which basically has a few methods in it. So let's go through these. So there's a get secret. So that is what's called down here. When we actually call to encrypt something, we pass it a configuration section, and we pass it the value that we want to encrypt. And we're passing it the configuration section because we're going to pull the secret out of that configuration section, or the configuration manager essentially. So we get the secret, and then we hand that off to another method in here to go and actually encrypt the data using that secret. We've also got the corresponding decryption methods, so we can reverse engineer a given encrypted value. So the idea is that we would encrypt the value, store that in our app settings, and then in our code we use the decryption side of it to reverse engineer that back to the original value again. So how can we go and do that? What we can do is in the program CS, to actually encrypt the value, we can add in another endpoint to encrypt the value, and I've got to go and add in crypto class. So then back over here, that gets included. So now I've got an endpoint called encrypt value that I can call, that will actually encrypt a value that we supply. So over in the browser, if I stop and restart this, and incidentally I should point out in the launch settings, I'm actually passing in an additional environment variable, which is this cipher secret value here, and that contains any value that you want, but that has to remain consistent, and you want to keep that out of your app settings. You want to keep this in your environment variables and not check this into source code. This value should never make it into your source repository, otherwise you're going to compromise your security, because everybody then knows your secret that you've used to encrypt all of your values in your app settings file. And that's the value that's actually pulled out here from the config. So that environment setting gets merged into the config, and the secret is then pulled out using the cipher secret key here. So we've got that running. So I can now come over here, and if I look back, what did I call that? Encrypt value. So I can call encrypt value and pass it a value that's going to get passed into the actual method here, and some value that I want to encrypt. So let's do 1234. So I get a value of that. That's my encrypted 1234 value. So given that I've got that, I can come over to the app settings and add in a val3 in there with that encrypted value. Then I can come back over to my config settings class and add in a val3 over here. that gets me a private variable and a property that's going to return me a string empty if val3 is null, and it's going to decrypt the value that gets passed in and then store that in this private variable. And we can see here that it's complaining because it doesn't know what config is, so we need to go and add in the configuration into this class now. So we're starting to see some of the headaches that this introduces. I now need the configuration section so that I can pull out the secret, so that I can decrypt that value. So this class is now happy. It gets passed in the configuration object. If I now come over to program CS, this will complain because this expects a parameterless constructor and my config settings. So let me just stop and run this, and we'll see that we get a big error saying there's no parameterless constructor. So we have to change this as well. We have to go and change our program CS around a little bit, and we have to instantiate our class manually, and instead of using the get method, we use the bind method to bind it to the actual instance of that class. So now we can actually, because we're creating the class and we're not leaving that to be automatically created for us, we don't need that parameterless constructor, and we can pass in the configuration into our settings class. So we can now get rid of that. And if I then just come down and copy that and put in a debug trace for val3 and run this up again, we can see that we've got our val3 with a value of 1234. So it's been correctly decrypted by our class when we've actually stored it, and hence when we're referencing it here, it's got the decrypted value. So we can use that approach across our entire code base, which is good, and this is the generally advised way that you should handle custom settings. But what if I have another section in my app settings, so maybe some disparate section? So I have a my custom settings 2, for instance, that has some other properties in it, so a val 4, 5 and 6, for instance. To actually go and read this, I need to create another my settings 2 class and val 4, 5 and 6, so that I can then bind that up against this particular section. So you're starting to get, a very disparate code base to deal with these various sections, which isn't really what we want, just because we're encrypting values. So that's a point of consideration. And also, not only that, but what about if we get some new developer that comes in, it's his first day on the job, he's full of confidence, and he goes and creates a class somewhere in your code base, and the first thing he does is he wants to get hold of that val3. So instead of going through the my settings class, he actually just goes to app configuration, gets hold of the iConfiguration itself, and uses this to actually traverse through and get to the val3. Let's just see what this gives us. Let's just log that out as local val3 and log that as local val3. Now when I run this up, what we get for local val3 is just the encrypted value. So he's bypassed all of that decryption mechanism that you've nicely put in place and broken the code, basically, because he's going to get the encrypted value here and he's going to start running into problems. So that's not going to help him on day one of his new job. So what's an alternative approach to address this problem? Well, let's go and let's talk through this configuration extensions that I've got here. So this is basically just an extension method on the configuration root object. So we can employ this against the iConfiguration that we get in our program CS, and we'll be able to call a decrypt method. And what this is doing is getting the secret out of the configuration, much like how crypto class was doing. And then it's walking through the entire application configuration, walking right down, recursing into that. And it's looking for any elements that start with a certain prefix that we pass into this class. When we call it, we pass in a prefix. And if it finds a value with that prefix, it basically goes and decrypts it, is what it's doing. So given that we've got this class, we can then come back over to our program CS, or we can come over to our my settings configuration, and we can get rid of all of this, and we can just treat this now like any other property. So we can just put a val3 in here. There's now nothing special about this from this particular class as far as it's concerned. And then if we come over to the program CS, we can get rid of that and basically revert that back to how it was before. So we can get rid of that bind and creating the class and just go back to using the actual get option. So it automatically instantiates our my settings for us. And then what we need to do is change our app settings quickly as well, so that we add in the prefix. So we'll call that something like encrypted value to indicate that this is an encrypted value that needs to be decrypted. And then back over here, right at the top of the program, after we've created our builder, we can actually hook into the configure services method, the callback that comes in. So as part of the build pipeline, when the application is building itself and setting up all the services and everything, we get this method called, and as part of that we there call our extension decryption method on the configuration object. So we get hold of the configuration object from the context, call the decrypt on it, and we pass in the cipher secret key to go and get that out of the configuration. So that's the environment variable that we're retrieving for that, and we're passing in some prefix that indicates that this particular value is an encrypted one. So this value here ties up with what we put in our app settings over here. So this is going to walk the entire tree and basically replace those encrypted values with their original values. So now if we stop this and run this up, that's started, and we can see that we get val3 is decrypted, and also local val3 is also decrypted. So depending on which way you want to go and get your configuration, if you go through the bespoke configuration settings class to get the config, or if you directly access it, you've already decrypted your values, so you get the same decrypted value in both places, which in my view is a pretty sweet solution. So we now have a mechanism to have encrypted values across our entire application configuration, including environment variables. So you could have an environment variable with that prefix, and it would equally get decrypted as part of this as well, because environment variables get merged into the configuration tree. And it doesn't impact the way our devs access the application settings across the code. So they can go through the configuration settings class, or they can directly access those settings and they get the same decrypted values, which is nice because we're actually helping our developer, our junior developer who created this code. We're kind of protecting him from breaking our code base. And this is one of those rare solutions that you can apply to an existing application with zero additional impact on the code base. So because all we're doing here is effectively changing and decrypting the configuration at the outset, we're not going to impact anything further in our code base. So we don't have to worry about anything breaking if we actually employ this encryption method. And that's it. That's all I wanted to show you for this. So what do you think? How do you handle encrypted values? Drop me a comment and let me know if you enjoyed this. If you did, don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.